Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this virtual professional development opportunity hosted by the Maine Department of Education. My name is Joe Schmidt, and I'm the Social Studies Specialist for the department. Today, we are lucky to have not one, but two, count them, two senior fellows from the Gilder Lehrman Institute for American History, Ron Nash and John McNamara. They have worked on units of instruction about teaching U.S. history for Gilder Lehrman. Ron reached out to me and really wanted to talk about essential questions and how that can really help make connections. And if you've paid attention to either my professional developments in person or virtually, you know how much I believe in the power of the right question really guiding a unit. So they are here today. They're going to go ahead and share these units, talk about the thinking about how can you work through them, and give you some exposure to that. And again, please ask questions as you think of them in real time. And I've posted the link if you want to look at the resources on your own. They are on my Professional Learning page. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Maine to Ron Nash and John McNamara.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
So very quickly, what I'll try to do here, and I'll set the plate, and then John will jump in and out with me, and hopefully you will too. John and I have partnered on a number of different projects over the last few years, and we've selected two different projects with two different topics. But again, going back to what we always stress, the root word of history is historia. And historia, is inquiry. So all good history, hopefully, or all good study of history in your classroom, hopefully studies with, asking questions, finding hopefully the right material, the right facts, the right documents, the right evidence to prove a point or, to disprove a point. So that's what we're going to be doing this morning. So the first thing, and hopefully everybody's able to pull it up, there's a unit that we posted, which is part of a new initiative inside Gilder Lehrman, teaching civics through history. And the unit that we pulled up here this morning, it's entitled Tensions, Twists, and Turns, the Development and Evolution of Voting Rights in the United States. So if you've got that in front of you, that's great, because you'll see, again, it's a long-winded suggestion. It's a lot of resources. And again, as teachers, you can pick and choose those things you want to focus on. But again, in the world that we live in, with regard to civic education, the importance of connecting history to civics, that's why we pursued this one particular avenue. So we have two units in this project so far. We chose this one as opposed to the one on free speech, because I think, and again, 2020, we've got an election coming up, and there's a lot of things that, people just don't realize, I think, about the nature of the long history of voting rights. So just a quick one, and John, I'll let you jump in because the essential questions become really important here. But this project started, again, with a question, what do students, what do teachers need to know about voting? And we reached out to a very interesting scholar, and you'll see if you're just thumbing through, the first couple of pages here, in your lesson, and the lesson we presented, that the historian that we chose is a guy named Alan Lichtman, who's at American University. And we asked Alan to be our secondary source. He had written a couple of books about the history of voting, and he'd written developed a couple of models to predict elections. And since 1980, he's sort of the go-to guy for a lot of politicians, public servants, historians, whatever, in terms of his accuracy and his predictive model. But his book about voting rights was very interesting, and we said, well, let's go back in time. Let's take a look at some of the things that most people probably don't realize, in terms of the conflict between, what's a right, what's a privilege, why isn't voting something that's embedded in the Constitution as a right? So there's a lot of things there. But, I don't want to be too long-winded. I'm going to give John an opportunity to jump in here in a second and kind of, take us through a few things with regard to the essential questions and then the documents that we chose, to assist. And again, they're all suggestions. We want teachers to be able to pick and choose ultimately the things that work best in their classroom, but we want to give them the framework, starting with the essential questions that allow students ultimately to answer those questions. So with that in mind, John, do you want to jump in?
Yeah.
Real quick, John, before you start, Ron, would you mind, can you load the document up on your presenter view for those who don't?
Oh, it didn't come up? Okay, let me. Did it come up? Did it come up?
Yep. Can you?
Okay, great. So everybody, if you haven't had a chance to download it, this is what we're going to be talking about. You know, the document itself, you know, tensions, twists, and again, every one of our lessons that we develop, you know, has lots of components that make it user-friendly, and then you take and, you know, twist it into the ways that you want to use it in the classroom. So, John?
Okay, good morning, everybody. One of the things that I wanted to focus in on is the importance of the essential question. And I mean, that's something that we are all very much aware of, but very often, you know, frequent student complaints would be, history is just one darn thing after the other. What's the point of all of it? And the point can be the essential question. And the second complaint of students very often is that history is an unending litany of facts and more facts. And very often, I know when I first started teaching that most of what I was asking students to do was factual recall rather than thinking. And I kind of learned in my first year or two that thinking is most important rather than factual recall. Why? Because, all right, if we can frame a lesson around a thought-provoking question, all right, a good thought-provoking question leads to thinking, and thinking leads to engagement, and engagement leads to interest, and interest can lead to learning. And I think that that's the cognitive process that we want to focus and frame all of our lessons on, at least in my view, no matter what the content is. So every piece or every collection of documents and content, if we can frame them and focus them with a thought-provoking essential question, that frames their reading, their discussion, their writing, because now they have a thought-provoking guide. And I'll be going over like a little bit later how we can use essential questions more universally in many lessons. But for this particular lesson, if you look on the second page, there's a menu of 3. And once again, you can start with one, and then when you go to one of the other lessons, you can move to another. So for the first one, to what extent should voting be viewed as an inalienable right, privilege, or duty for Americans? And as you would get into this lesson, which I think Ron is going to do, you will see that for the founding fathers, voting was a privilege. It was not a right. And that one of the things that we show in this unit is, how did voting evolve from being a privilege into a right, and ultimately we hope a duty for all Americans in the upcoming election. The other essential question there is, which it's a menu for your choice, to what extent has the United States been a nation of the people, by the people, and for the people throughout its history? And by going through this unit, by going through the documents, the students will see that the United States at its inception was truly not of the people, by the people, for the people. In fact, in the first presidential election, they estimate that only 6% of the American people voted for George Washington, and he was the only candidate. And that was because women couldn't vote, blacks couldn't vote to a very large degree. There were property restrictions, there were religious restrictions, there were income restrictions on the part of the states. And that's the other interesting thing about this concept. One of the evolutionary aspects is of voting rights, that under the Constitution, the states controlled who could vote, when they could vote. And the evolution is that from the beginning of the country down to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is in the final lesson in this unit, the federal government has played an increasingly dominant role. So after the Civil War, with the 14th and 15th Amendments, with giving women the right to vote, with the 19th Amendment giving people 18 years of age or older the right to vote. So those are all federal government initiatives, and then of course the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So one of the things that we want students to see that's focused and framed by the essential question is, to what extent has the United States been a nation of the people, by the people, and for the people throughout its history? Who was eligible to vote at any particular era of time? Who was included? Who was excluded? And then finally, the third essential question, to what extent have governments, federal, state, local, in the United States represented and reflected the will of the people? Sort of, all right, similar to the second question. And what we want students to think about is, as I said before, initially, states controlled who could vote, and what would be the qualifications for voting. And every state had its own requirements. Ultimately, with the progression of history, by the time of the aftermath of the Civil War, the federal government then steps in with the 14th and the 15th Amendment, and then ultimately with subsequent amendments, and then finally with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So I will come back with a little more about essential questions, but I'm just going to turn it over to Ron.
Yeah, no, I want to take everybody through something, and as I'm talking, I'd like you to jump in. If you've, and especially if you've been able to pull up the documents separately, because I think, again, we're talking about a subject which I think has a lot of aha moments to it, in terms of, people say, well, the history of voting, well, that should be simple. In the beginning, all white men could vote. And as John just pointed out, well, that's not necessarily true. And that number, that startling number that Jill Lepore calculated, in fact, a historian at Harvard, 6% of the eligible voters vote for George Washington. Well, what does that say? It says something about, the limitations of voting in the beginning of our history. But that continued rather dramatically throughout all of our history, particularly into the 20th century. But what I want to point out, and I'm jumping around here a little bit, but I want to point out, what we have here for you in terms of this particular resource. And again, I want you to be able to take a look and maybe ask questions as I point some things out. I know we normally in a a seminar type of environment, we'd have a lot of time to have you maybe have read some of this stuff previously. John's pointed out the importance of the resources in terms of the essential questions, but I want to just jump a little bit here in the beginning of this document that I shared, and just show you some of the array of materials that you'd have available to you. We've taken materials and chunked it into 2 different lessons, and then also provided, I don't know why my computer's not being friendly here, but provided you with lots of different options in terms of choices, what kind of resources you would want to have, to make available to your students, but also to pair that, with the essential questions, and also at the same time to pair that, with the secondary source that I mentioned about Alan Lichtman providing for us. So just taking a look, I mean, obviously you have opportunity to take a look at the Constitution, what it says. We talk about the Constitutional Convention. Only about 1% of the time of the Constitution's construction was devoted to voting. And then as time goes on, obviously in the Civil War era, the expansion of voting by way of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But I want to point out a couple of things here, really, really essential. And Maine fits into the story in an important way. So I'll put that as an emphasis. One of the things and again, we're not going to have time to read everything, but if you've got the document in front of you, if you even just jump ahead to where Professor Lichtman on page 17 and 18 provides the first of two historical backgrounds. He makes mention of something, and some people might feel a little uncomfortable the way he frames it. He said, from 1787 down to the 1860s, the post Civil War, the Reconstruction period, that we lived in what he frames as a white man's republic. And he even frames it in even more startling terms. And that's why I want to kind of point something out. Again, I'm going to be talking more about what's here. And later on, hopefully you'll be able to go back and drill down. But, he points out that, when the Constitution was first adopted, that only 5 of the 16 states, in that time period and a little bit beyond that, up to 1800, had mandated white-only voting. Now, you think about that for a second. Okay, yeah, some southern states, they mandated white only, but not every one of them. But then eventually, over time, increasingly, more and more states in their state constitutions adopted a white only voting. And then by the time of the Civil War, I'm just going to point something out, and then we'll come back to some of the documents. And this says something about the Civil War as well, that by 1860, 28 of the 33 states, so that's including the states in the Confederacy and in the Union, but 28 of the 33 states had adopted in their state constitutions white-only voting. Now let that sink in just for a second. Okay, so the Civil War, when it starts, obviously, is not about the issue of slavery. Yeah, it's not about the issue of allowing a lot of things to happen. We know that over the course of the war, that does change. But importantly, in the story that we've put before you here in this lesson, is that how did that happen? Why did it happen? It raises questions. We've chosen a few documents, one in particular from the state constitution of Pennsylvania in 1838, where there's this massive debate about whether or not to basically restrict suffrage to whites only. And there was a substantial free black population in Pennsylvania. And if you go to the document, you'll see, that they became very vocal in their protest about what was happening in 1838. And despite their protest, boom, the Constitution has changed. Pennsylvania becomes one of those, as, I just pointed out, 28 of the 32, of the 6 states, or 5 states, excuse me, that didn't go to that white-only formula were the New England states, to include Maine. So, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Maine, not going to that formula. So again, that just points out something dramatic in terms of a paradox, something dramatic in terms, and again, for your students, and we've provided those kinds of documents in this lesson, that John has pointed out the essential questions that allow you to go to the documents, and that we've also provided you in the context of this resource, organizers, ways of having a shared read experience, ways of encouraging a reading comprehension program that ties not only the historical content, but reading like an historian, looking at literacy strategies, providing literacy types of, materials that would allow your students to organize their thoughts and then debate, discuss, and ultimately write about the essential questions that John framed. So John, do you want to pick it up at that point?
Yeah, could I just want to make a comment about the like Robert Purpose, a appeal of 40,000 citizens. I think that this document is really important because it can provide students with the concept you can have the right to vote and then you can lose the right to vote. And that having the right to vote historically does not mean that you're always going to have the right to vote. And this is an instance where in the state of Pennsylvania, where African Americans initially had the right to vote, and then with the revisions of the state constitution, they lost the right to vote. And this is a very poignant document because it basically demonstrates an African American gentleman saying, we are people. We live in York in our community together. We had the right to vote, and now we have lost the right to vote. And another episode of African Americans having had the right to vote and losing the right to vote, obviously, would be the Jim Crow era of the late 19th century and the opening decades of the 20th century, where African American men had the right to vote by the 15th Amendment, and then ultimately, in practicality, they lost the right to vote. And I think that that's an important concept with regard to voting rights, because we can very easily, all of us, take it for granted, oh, we have the right to vote. But historically, people in the history of the United States have been given the right to vote, and they have lost the right to vote. And that voting right, the right to vote, is very precious right. So I think that that's an important thing. The other thing that I wanted to point out, Ron, is we have two paintings here.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you could pull those up, Ron, for a
Sure. Let me ask a quick question. Does everybody have the opportunity to have that full document at your disposal? Yes? Maybe.
Yes.
Okay, great. Now that's important, because as we're talking, I know we're going to kind of bounce through. As I'm looking at the resource, I mean, it's lengthy, and I caveat saying, well, the expectation is you wouldn't be able to use, maybe if you had time, it would be great to use all the materials. But if you had to pick and choose, we've given you text and we've given you visuals. So John, looking for the visuals here, there are a number of them, that are here.
Well, there's those two charts that I think are okay.
Yeah, here's one of the visuals.
All right. So there's two paintings by George Khalid Bingham, very well-known American artist, and they both deal about voting rights. And one of the things that you could do is that you could show these two paintings and then ask students, what do these two paintings reflect and tell us about voting rights in the United States at that time, the antebellum period of the United States history? And basically, by looking at these two paintings, one, we see all men, we don't see women, and two, we see all basically white men. So that therefore, one of the messages is, yes, the United States was a fledgling and unfolding democracy, but it never crossed the color line before the Civil War. And so this would be one resource, both of these paintings, if you wanted to introduce art. Ron, could you, all right, flip back to those two charts. So another, all right, pair of visual resources would be these like two. I think if you scroll down.
Oh, no, I got to go back. Yeah, no, it's I've got it. Going the wrong direction.
Right.
John, real quick, while Ron's looking for that, there's somebody wanted to know, does this unit at all cover the right or the loss of voting for American citizens in prison?
No.
No. However, when we've done workshops with this, you can readily go to the New York Times or the Washington Post, and they have, within the last year, even within the last 3 or 4 months, had several articles with regard to the controversy. I believe it's in the state of Florida and Iowa, that there has been legislation proposed that people who are convicted of voting of felonies would lose their voting rights. And so that you can supplement this with current events, news articles from, I'm sure that local papers have carried this as well, but I know from my own research that there's been a number of articles in the New York Times as well as the Washington Post about, and then other things, people who owe money to the state. There are some states who have removed voting rights as as a result of debt. And these are issues that are probably going to be ultimately decided by the Supreme Court. But so I would use newspaper articles to cover that aspect of current issues with regard to voting rights.
Well, one other thing too, John, if you're looking at the structure of this lesson, so thank you for asking that question about, about the prison population. But the last two parts of this lesson, there's 5 parts, so I take it back. 1 and 2 parts of this lesson, the first, second parts of this lesson involve historical background, and it doesn't include the issue of the imprisoned population. But in lessons 3 and 4, we also make reference, and I give you a prompt to go to something called All Sides, okay, which is a web page that allows all sides, left, right, and center, in terms of points of view, to be explored. And if you put in, something that would be a prompt like, imprisoned population, or voting rights suffrage for imprisoned population, you would be able to pull up articles in contemporary time that would allow you to see an argument from somebody who has a left of center point of view, a center point of view, or a right of center point of view. And then you could have your students debate and explore that type of activity. So hopefully that helps as well. Just want to make sure that you know what you have at your disposal in terms of this resource. And as John pointed out, we did not cover everything. We got, hopefully the big chunks of things, but unfortunately we weren't able to include every aspect of voting in this resource. So
another interesting activity, if you want to introduce some math, would be those two charts that are on pages 28 and 29. Ron has the first one up, 3A, which is a chronology of property requirements in order to vote between the years of 1790 and 1855, just before the Civil War. And you can ask students, okay, what story is being told by this chart with regard to property requirements in order to vote? And obviously it's very evident that between 1790 and 1855, the number of states that still maintained property requirements in order to vote declined. So in 1855, there were 31 states, and only 3 of them had property qualifications. Where if we compare that to 1790, when there were only 13 states, 10 of those had property qualifications. So for white Americans, by this chart, we are seeing that the United States is moving to more universal suffrage, at least for white men. And Ron, could you scroll down to the next chart, 3B,
sure,
which is just below it? Okay, now, at the same time that the prior chart shows what's happening to voting rights for white Americans who are male, this second chart here is a chronology of what is happening to the voting rights of African Americans. So if you look in 1790, where there are 13 states, 3 states had exclusions of African American, voting. Having voting rights. And then you can see the progression. And by 1855, when there are 31 states, there are now 25 states that have restrictions and exclusions against African Americans voting. And this obviously, 31 states includes the North as well as the South. So one of the things, by combining both of these charts, students can see, while voting rights for white Americans, at least males, are increasing, voting rights and opportunities for African Americans during the same period are, drastically decreasing. Okay, so that's just another, you could use the paintings, and you could use these comparative charts to show what's happening to African Americans and what's happening to white American males.
And just to take us through the rest of this particular, like I said, the focus historically in the first two parts of this unit, the first chunk takes us down to the Civil War and Reconstruction period, and then the second lesson takes us, into the 20th century. So just so that you know what you have at your disposal here, again, the essential questions continue to be asked, but again, addressed just at different historical moments in time. And then, like I said, Alan Lichtman takes up the argument in the secondary source for us, sets the tone for how does voting, again, dramatically twist and turn and change in terms of major social movements of the 20th century, not the least of which would be the suffrage movement. Here we are in the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. So the important work around that in terms of being able to explore how did that come about. We've provided, again, some resources, hopefully resources that you haven't seen before, like this, which again is an argument that's being made closer in time to the actual adoption of the 19th Amendment, or a document like this, which ties women's suffrage to a wartime argument in World War One. I want to just quick aside here. We're going to shift gears in a little bit, but I want to point out that another part of what we've been doing, John and myself, is developing a whole array of World War One type of concentration, in terms of content and in terms of essential questions and in terms of documents, hopefully that you've not seen before, and new ways to explore that war through, again, visuals, by using art, by using music, by using other forms of historical documents that normally are not something you'd have to do a lot of hunting and pecking and researching to find. So we've hopefully put some of that together for you as well. But I just want to again point out that taking this story into the 20th century, the two biggest social movements that we concentrated on, were obviously the women's movement, and then obviously the civil rights movement later in the 20th century. But we've taken that story, just so that into the 21st century as well. So the issues that we tried to frame with the essential questions, and also addressing particularly important Supreme Court cases, not the least of which is the Holder case in 2013. So we've taken the story, from 1787 down to 2013 and beyond, by way of saying, well, the story's not over, that the twists and the turns and the tensions, remain. John, I don't know if you want to jump in just to conclude this piece of it. Did we lose John? We might have. Okay, so I'm going to just stop at this point. Ask if there are any additional questions about anything we've taken a look at here so far. Again, in real time, if you think that this is, even as a quick check, do you see in this an opportunity to be able to integrate this kind of work into your classroom?
Any questions or thoughts for Ron?
It looks like a fantastic resource to include, and makes our jobs a lot easier to then teach this material effectively with all the resources. One of the questions I had in relation to all this is, at what point did the popular vote become something that was seen as significant in presidential elections, considering in the beginning it was just the electors essentially with very few voters? So at what point did people start attaching the popular vote to some form of legitimacy as far as the president winning?
I would, argue that if you're looking at Lichtman's argument too, probably in the 20th century in terms of impact. But again, we go back and the story about the Electoral College, I guess we can use that as a sidebar, and particularly what's happened in, several significant recent elections, where the popular vote is not as important ultimately as the electoral vote. But I think that people became aware of wanting to expand. I think popular vote expansion, I think that story starts to really develop after the Civil War, in terms of the 14th and 15th Amendments, and obviously, the 17th and the 19th, you go on. And we address some of that in the resources, but I think, we've allowed teachers to want to, to explore that on their own, given the resources that we've at least suggested. So I don't know if that answers your question, but, in terms of, the debate about popular vote versus electoral college, I think that's, obviously still with us. But wanting to expand, who can vote, who has the access to the vote, the debate over, as we quickly point out very early in our discussion, the fact that voting's not ever been really defined as a right. It's one of those things where you'd like it to be, but and with all of the discussion most recently about voter suppression, that's another issue. I mean, we sort of hint at it, but we don't necessarily hit you on the head with it in terms of the resources. So, but we allow that to be explored. The fact that there is so much that has been done to suppress the vote at the very moment that we talk about America's, democratic heritage and the importance of democracy. Lots of things that we give lip service to. And again, I always kind of emphasize what's the difference between the ideal and the real. And unfortunately, those tensions, are very still very much with us. And unfortunately, again, a lot of people don't realize what I'm talking about when I bring that up to, not you guys, but when I bring that up to somebody else in the debate. People will say, "Oh, we're a democracy. We have all these rights." And I said, "Well, yes, we do, but at the same time, voting is not one of those rights. In terms of definition and something that's defined by law." Anyway, I'm on my stump speech here. Sorry. So, I think we lost John.
Ron, and I am checking to see if he's logging back in. He has not.
Yeah. But that's okay. I mean, John will jump back in here. But I just wanted to make sure that we had an opportunity to take a look at a couple of resources. And again, if this is one that is something that you find valuable, I'm happy to explore and to follow up. If you want to get in contact with me, my email is nash@gilderlehrman.org. So if you have follow-up kinds of questions that I might not be able to address, or that you think you'd want, you might think about later on when you have a chance to go through all these materials. Sometimes you need a little opportunity to digest something and then say, hey, I had an idea, or I had a question that I didn't get a chance to answer. Please feel free to contact myself or John. Again, his email, same thing, his last name, McNamara@gilderlehrman.org. So let me do this. Let me just.
Ron, can I interrupt you real quick?
Sure,
John's
please.
coming back in. There was a question in the chat.
Yep.
Somebody said, I've been struggling with how to present material, especially current cases, without seeming to be biased towards the Republican Party.
Yeah.
Do you have suggestions for how to present this safely?
Well, I think what we've shown here, I mean, one way or the other, as good teachers, we always try to, say, well, we're going to, I mentioned this in the beginning, my framework is always to emphasize the importance of history in its definition is not the past. History in its definition is inquiry. So we are, if I'm suggesting anything, it's like, well, today class, we're going to talk about, a topic. We're going to inquire and ask a lot of questions. We're not going to ask her the only questions that can be asked. And oh, by the way, when we ask questions, there are wrong answers. Okay, so if you can't prove, something in your inquiry through the use of evidence, well, shame on you, shame on me if I can't show you where to maybe look, or at least point you in the right direction. But again, in terms of objectivity, I guess that's the way we always want to go. We don't want to seem like we're, already predisposing our students in one direction or another. We want to give them the opportunity to explore very broadly. That's why we have this resource, to explore something very broadly, and hopefully introduce everybody to some of the materials and some of the, the facts and some of the resources that they may not have seen before. Or if they've seen it before, maybe they've not seen the emphasis that you could apply or have them take a look at in the course of asking those questions that we start to frame. They're not the only questions. They're not the only essential questions that can be asked. And of course, during the course of your study with your students, say, hey, here's some 3 essential questions that are tied to this in the beginning. Are there other essential questions that we should be asking? Are there ways? And again, essential questions have very broad, open-ended possibilities. Again, you ask and answer, and sort of like, questions flow from questions. So, as you ask one, another question pops up, and I'm hoping I'm answering your question. But if I didn't, let me know, and I'll try to recircle back. I'm assuming silence is okay. So,
there's a question, Ron,
yeah.
Is there anything in the unit about voting rights for the physically or mentally challenged?
No, that's another, like I said, a lot of the topics that are very important topics. We tried to go with the broad issues, related to, like I said, certain social movements. We weren't able to hit every aspect of every thing. And that would be a great essential question. To what extent, should there be, accommodations for, both either physically or mentally challenged folks? But I think, again, that kind of topic, through the other vehicle that I mentioned that are in the 3rd and 4th parts of this lesson, allow you to, plug that into a question or plug that into searching for resources. And I think there's plenty of stuff that the All Sides vehicle that I mentioned would allow you to enhance your discussion in the classroom. So I know we have some people that are working on other aspects of that, but John and I haven't worked on that for this particular unit. So I think John's rejoined us. So at least I see a
Lost my connection, but
there he is.
I think that one of the beauties of teaching history and framing and focusing it on a daily basis with an essential question is that you are letting students make those, to take viewpoints, that you are challenging them to take a position based on documents. And so therefore, we don't have to take a position, that becomes the responsibility and the activity of students, both individually as well as collaboratively, to look at the information, discuss it, write about it, chat about it, and then draw your own conclusions and then share them. And that can lead then to further dialogue for class discussion.
So again, are there other questions that we might try to address, or did we hit everybody's question?
Well, I just saw Kate's question. Thank you very much. I think, as far as what documents we choose, we have to be very careful. And I think as teachers, in my view, we have a responsibility to, if there are 2 sides or 3 sides on an issue, that we provide documents, whether visual or literary, that will reflect both viewpoints. So I think that becomes one of the responsibilities of a teaching professional, that when we select documents, that if it is a very controversial issue and there are legitimate arguments and viewpoints on both sides, that we provide students then with documents that would reflect both viewpoints. And then that becomes the beauty and the interest of like class discussion, where they use those documents to support their positions as evidence.
Just looking too, so some of the questions we may not be able to address right now, but I'll try to later. I see there were some questions about literary questions. Somebody asked, what books might be recommended, as a fiction source or as a I'm just going back to that question. But one that comes to mind is a book called The Last Hurrah, about a political campaign and political parties, political machines in the mid 20th century. So that might be one opportunity to take a look at something there, or an excerpt, if nothing else, from a book like that. I mean, there are a couple of others that'll come to mind, but just off the top of my head, that would be one. John, would you have any second, literary sources, novels that would be connected to this?
I would have to think about it, a little
Yeah.
bit more. Obviously, yeah, I would have to really think about it, but we could get back to you on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a question here about the two-party system that kind of goes beyond what we focused on here, but yeah, I mean, that's a whole nother a whole nother unit of study. Why do we only have a two-party system, and why, when we have third-party voting, why doesn't the third party ever seem to historically sustain itself? Although third parties have had an impact on several elections in terms of their outcome. But that, like I said, if I'm addressing the question, it actually goes beyond the scope of how we envisioned, where to take this particular resource. So, we looked at the issue of voting and voting rights, in the context of a civic responsibility, and then debating the whole idea of voting as a right. So that's sort of narrow focus for what we've got here, but lots of resources, and that allows for, as John mentioned, expanding the scope of where you want to bring this with your students in terms of their interest in exploring something like this further.
And I think one of the takeaways that we would hopefully convey to students is that, as we had said earlier, that voting began as a privilege for people of a certain income or a certain religion or a certain property ownership amount, and then evolved into universal suffrage for people of a certain race or of a certain gender, and then evolved into ultimately true, universal, suffrage rights. So I think the one way that we can challenge students is we've gone from privilege to inalienable right. And then the third concept is, what about duty? Is it a responsibility and a duty of being an American citizen, as shown in the 14th Amendment? To what extent do all Americans have a duty to vote? Not merely a right, but a responsibility. And that's something then, given the history that students would learn, given the documents that students would read and discuss, to what extent do they view voting not just as an inalienable right for them, but as an inalienable duty as a citizen of the United States? So I think that that's a concept, from privilege to right and to duty would be one where, if you were teaching seniors who are 18 years old, and then are they registered to vote? Do they plan on voting? To what extent are they trying to be an informed citizen? So I think that last component of duty would be something that we could have very interesting conversations about with students.
And I noticed there's an ongoing discussion about concern that parents have that one particular source might be biased and another source might be biased or whatever. That's why I reference back to the All Sides website. This way you're saying, hey, we're looking at a topic with a question in mind, but the topic has given us the opportunity to draw from this particular vehicle, this All Sides website, that then provides us with an article which comes from the left, an article which comes from the center, an article which comes from the right, and allows, and again, we've embedded a couple of organizers into our resource, which allows you to then explore, okay, what, if you looked on, if you pulled up the document, it's page 78 in our resource, which allows you to have your students then, either in individual, pair, or groups, go to an article, analyze the article. Is it from the right? Is it from the center? Is it from the left? It gives you some basic frameworks in terms of being able to pull the article, dig down into the article, and then compare. How does the article from the left compare to the article, or the journalistic piece from the right, as opposed to the journalistic piece from the center? And then, as a total exploration, be able to give you the opportunity to say to, both your students, yourself, and to the parents, if they're concerned, hey, we looked at the broad spectrum of things, and we were able to, to come up with, evidence from different points of view, which allows us then to answer the essential questions that we, are exploring throughout this particular unit. Hopefully that helps. So
I think the other aspect is too that with regard to parent reaction, if I'm teaching with an open-ended, evaluative, essential question, I would say to parents, what I'm trying to do is not for me to take a viewpoint, but I'm posing an issue for the students to think about, to read about, to write about, and to talk about, and develop their own position and viewpoint. So what I'm trying to do, parents, is I'm trying to educate and train students to become responsible citizens. And one way to do that is to have them think about the important historical issues as well as current issues that face our society. I'm providing them with diverse resources, and that I am asking students to develop the responsibility and the skills to use evidence to develop their viewpoints. And that's the focus of my teaching, parents. It's to get kids to think. And that's so important being a 21st century American citizen. And that's how I would respond to parents anyway. If I could just do one other thing, Ron.
sure.
And Joe, I just wanted to say something about the essential question from a teacher's perspective is very important, because by having the essential question, it can help you decide what documents to select and how you want students to use those documents. So for example, once you have the essential question, I then would ask myself this follow-up question, and here it is. What information do the students need to know to develop a viewpoint on the essential question? And when I pose that question to myself, it immediately gets me thinking about, oh, well, I should include this document and that document and this document. In other words, I start thinking about what evidence can I provide students so that they can ultimately develop a viewpoint. So I like to call it the magic question that I'm asking myself after I have the essential question, which can lead to my planning. They must know, this is essential, this not so much. This I can leave out. So with the essential question, it helps me deal with the issue. I don't have to teach everything that's in chapter 17. I emphasize in my lessons those aspects that are in chapter 17, which will help students develop a viewpoint on the essential question. And then I will provide students with documents that will help them ultimately develop a viewpoint on the essential question. So if you look at one of the other things that we've posted, the essential questions, the emergence of the United States in the 20th century, under each of those essential questions, we've put, all right, the content or the documents or the places where you could look to provide students with evidence for that essential question.
No, thanks, John. That's great. And this sort of a segue into something, I just wanted to go to something, again, quickly, but open up the fact that John and I are available as after the fact. When this presentation's over, don't hesitate to just reach out to us if we haven't answered everything that you would like to have answered. But I wanted to skip, it's not skip, but segue to another. Did that come up, Americans All?
Yes.
Yeah, no. So, here, John and I, in fact, are probably in the next month or so going to explore this topic a lot more in depth in terms of from a broader perspective, talking about the topic of immigration, which obviously is another one of those civic discussions that is at the forefront of a lot of things that we've been doing the last 10 years or so, maybe even more, throughout our history. But just a quick context for what this particular resource is. The World War One Centennial came to Gilder Lehrman about 3 years ago now and said, could you develop some lesson plans? And we did. We developed 5 long, in-depth resources on topics, ranging from women and World War One and African Americans in World War One, art in World War One. But anyway, this particular resource, is a snapshot of the importance of immigrants to World War One, and provides, again, essential questions, documents, perspectives, and a lot of what I would consider, John will sing for us, music, okay, related to the whole array of issues that come up, with this topic of immigration. Just a quick fact. Again, we went to an historian, Nancy Ford, who's an expert in the field of immigration history, particularly as it affects World War One, and we got a secondary source, as a jump-off point. And in discussions with Nancy Ford, we were able to identify a lot of documents and a lot of things. And again, topics that have connection not only to, the World War One era, but have a connection to today. We hear a lot of talk about America First. Well, there's some stunning artwork and cartoons that are part of this unit. Let me just jump off with a point here, a very important fact. Again, a lot of people know that in some of our more contemporary military engagements in the Middle East, that there are quite a few, immigrants that are part of the American Armed Forces. Well, guess what? In World War One, this is a stunning fact if you don't know it, 20% of the American Army was foreign-born, and that's why we call this unit Americans All, foreign-born soldiers. So, that jump-off point, raises a lot of important essential questions, which, we do frame, and then we explore, again, historically, in several different ways. And again, we probably provide, the opportunity for, again, a reasonable discussion, an objective discussion, sometimes a humorous discussion, but and ultimately a very serious discussion, of what does all that mean, in terms of American history, and how does that connect not only to then, but to now. So, with that in mind, I know we're probably going to run out of time. We're going a little over 12 o'clock, which is fine, and I'm willing to stay, and talk, to that issue. But I would like you, to have the opportunity, obviously, to explore some of these resources at your leisure in more depth. And if you want some of those other resources that I mentioned, art in World War One is really fascinating when you talk about combat, from the perspective of the soldiers. What we did is have one soldier, one Marine, who were actually artists during World War One, to be able to explore from their own personal experiences what combat was and what it means, and a whole bunch of other issues. So anyway, there's all kinds of stuff here. Hopefully, we're opening up some interest that you would want to pursue further with us. And, again, we'd love to, to do that. So Joe,
Yep, no, you're good. I was just gonna say, there's been a lot of good feedback in the chat box of people thinking about the resources and how to think. I can give you about 8 or 10 more minutes. If there are people here who do have questions
Yeah,
for you.
yeah, absolutely.
I
Yeah,
think
in
this,
fact, I'd love to entertain some questions if we could. I mean, rather than me just pointing out some stuff and,
because
you
I
know,
think this is the really crucial, this part, and this is what people are commenting on about, like this bigger picture approach to thinking about, there's these really nice made units that people can take in and think about
mhm.
some of it. But in this idea of like how you guys sit down and really think through the creation of the units,
Yeah, yeah.
I think such a valuable piece for teachers. And that's what I'm hearing in the chat box. I see Wendy kind of nodding her head. So again, I can give probably about 8 or 9 more minutes if people want to continue to pick the brains of Ron and or John.
Sure, absolutely. And John, if you want to sing when Tony goes over the top.
I think I'll pass on that
There's
one.
some music embedded here, and it's intended partially to be humorous, but also very serious. You know, the song I just referenced, "When Tony Goes Over the Top," was a very popular song at the time, now forgotten, but at the time it was something that people were familiar with, and it celebrated, you know, this particular Italian immigrant who then he was a barber who then becomes a soldier, you know, and he celebrated in very important ways. And we took that song and we positioned it against a song which was sort of anti-immigrant in its context. So, you know, so you have that dynamic again, you know, where the ideal is, well, we love everybody. We want everybody to be included as an American, but then, you know, there are limits to that Americanism, you know, under the pressure of war. So, but again, the two songs provide the opportunity, you know, for students to say, wow, you know, we love our immigrants, but, you know, and we have this other side, you know, this what became in the post World War I period of time, you know, a very anti-immigrant experience. So anyway, but yeah, for John and I, what we often do, and when we still do, you know, we kind of bounce ideas against each other. We, you know, start to think about the broader picture of a framework. You know, to have any one of these lessons, it probably takes about a month or more just to get and we have the leisure to do that. I realize that's one of the benefits of, you know, doing what we do, just being able to sit around and think and be paid to do it. But you know, John and I then, you know, think about, well, can we reach out to an historian? Can we reach out to somebody who then provides a little bit of additional guidance? And then from there, we begin to, in fact, let me, as I'm chatting here, tell you about another project. If you haven't seen it, there's going to be a new grant, U.S. grant program that's coming up, a 3-part series on the History Channel, starting on next Monday, John, right?
Yes.
But John and I got this like request to come up with some study guides in a very, very short window, like a week. But again, under pressure, we often work well as well. But, you know, the idea was, okay, you know, here's this 3-part series about Grant's life. What can you do to provide resources? And as I was explaining, John and I collaborate, we talk, we try to figure out, you know, what we already know and what we don't know, and then begin to some extent, sometimes leisurely, sometimes not so leisurely, explore and find resources that would, you know, again, be capable of being used in the classroom, and also, you know, stimulate, you know, interest by way of, it's not just a text, it's a visual, it's an audio, it's whatever it might be, you know, to give that other sensory approach to saying that historical documents are broad, and then as broad as you can make them, and as broad as you can make connections, you know, to the past, but asking questions at the same time, and giving evidence, you know, new kinds of evidence that would make students a lot more excited about history. You can see I am. So anyway, but
if I could just answer Kate's question, and I want to thank you, Kate. That's a wonderful, important question.
John,
Kate,
can I interrupt you, because I really, really do agree with that, and I'm going to ask a request. So the question, Ron, I don't know if you saw, is Kate said, what is your process for writing the essential?
Yeah.
Do you mind if I stop this recording and start a separate one so that I can just pull out your 5, maybe can't be more than 10 minutes, but 5, 6, 7 minute. Can I have that as a separate video, just the essential question? Do you mind if I do that?
No, that's fine.
Okay.
Whatever you think is best.
So I'm going to give a very, very quick thank you, Ron and John, so anybody watching this presentation knows that we did say thank you.